Beidou is one of the strongest off-field DPS units in Genshin Impact, and though a lot of people know it, many players choose not to invest in Beidou or use her due to common misconceptions about her kit and playstyle as well as her builds. So today, in this video, I want to talk about Beidou in depth with a very detailed kit overview, artifact build, weapon explanation, team suggestions, and more. And as usual, there will be timestamps in the description. With that being said, my name is Braxophone, and let's talk about our favorite pirate. But first, are you a player that's been waiting a while for challenging boss fights? Well, you're in luck, because this video is sponsored by Raid Shadow Legends. I've been waiting to say that for so long. Raid is a turn-based battle MMORPG, meaning it's massively multiplayer and online while maintaining all of the great aspects of turn-based combat and role-playing games. There are over 600 champions with unique builds and stats, and with all of the challenging content in the game, you're definitely going to want to toughen up your roster, especially because Raid just released the newest addition to their boss roster, the Hydra. The Hydra is a crazy hard clan boss. It's got multiple heads, and for each head, there's different mechanics to learn. Once you're strong enough to challenge the Hydra, you're going to have a long and tough fight ahead of you. And if you're a new player looking to get into more challenging Raid content, the game gives you tons of free energy and items to give you a boost when you start the game. My personal favorite thing about Raid so far has been that it includes PvE and PvP. On top of that, if you're worried about summoning the right champions, don't be. Raid has so many champions that they give out summoning shards super often, so you can be more than set as a free-to-play player if you choose to be. Right now is the best time to get started with Raid, and if you use my link or QR code, new players can get a free bundle of resources and a mystery champion. Hit that link and see who you get. Thanks to Raid for sponsoring this video, and let's get back to talking about our favorite pirate. So in this section, I actually ended up being way more detailed than I planned, but I promise all of the information is relevant to Beidou's play, and I hope you're able to take away at least one new piece of information from it. Let's start off with Beidou's elemental skill. So basically, her skill is a counter that can be leveled up by taking hits from enemies while the skill is held. Now, a common misconception with this is that the counter is based on how much damage you take, but in reality, it's actually about how many hits you take, not damage. Once you get hit 2 different times, that will get you to your highest level of charge. Her tap skill generates 2 particles, but on her hold skill, that amount of particles is increased by the shield's hits taken up to a max of 4 total particles. So basically, tap is going to be 2, hold with 1 hit is 3, and hold with 2 hits is 4 particles. Now, when you get Beidou's first Ascension passive, you unlock what's called a perfect counter. This is basically where Beidou can deal the maximum amount of damage for a 2-hit charge on her hold skill just by tapping her skill right when an enemy makes contact. It's like a parry in most games, where if you time it right on hit or slightly before the hit, it'll activate. When you perfect counter, you get the full 4 particles. So because of that Ascension passive, skilled players are actually going to have less issues with Beidou's battery and energy requirements in general, which I'll talk a little bit more about in the artifacts and team section. To kind of explain the math behind why a counter can do so much damage, the scaling on it is just ridiculous. You're always going to be dealing the base damage, but for every hit up to 2 on your hold skill, you're dealing bonus damage on top of the base. So with my talent at level 8, the multiplier going into the damage formula becomes 195% plus 256% plus another 256% on a maxed out counter. But in my opinion, perfect countering is mostly important for battery purposes, even though it can output a ton of damage. Now, the main reason generating lots of energy for Beidou is important is because of her burst, which costs 80 to activate. Her skill cooldown is actually short, but if you're not using her as a main DPS, it can be inconvenient to switch to her every 8 seconds to use her skill. So if you can learn to perfect counter consistently, it's a huge plus. Beidou's elemental burst is the bread and butter of her kit and one of the most misunderstood skills in the entire game. When you activate it, it deals a decent hit of electro damage, but every hit you deal to an enemy with a normal or charged attack will deal bonus electro damage. Now, the kicker to this is that the electro hit can jump to other enemies, but the skill doesn't say how many. After testing, at Constellation 0, it can jump to 2 different enemies after the first hit, dealing up to 3 instances of electro damage per second at max. At Constellation 2, you jump up to a max of 4 or 5 jumps per second, but I'll cover Constellations at the end of the video. The other important thing to know is that the electro hits can chain back to the same enemy after being on another, so to get the most out of it, you need to be attacking at least 2 enemies, otherwise her burst loses a lot of value. The lightning will stop chaining if you don't have enough enemies. The electro damage on her burst can be procced by characters other than Beidou. It lasts for up to 15 seconds and the cooldown is 20 seconds. Lastly, her Ascension 2 passive makes her a lot more effective on field because it increases her attack speed, normal and charged attack damage by 15%. Charged attacks still aren't that useful, but it will reduce the delay to start her charged attacks as well. For Beidou talents, regardless of how you're going to play her, you're going to want to prioritize her burst, then skill, and then normal attacks. Even if you have her as an on-field carry, her burst can dish out so much damage over multiple enemies that it'll end up outdoing her normal attacks, so it's best to just level her burst anyways. So next up is gonna be artifact builds, and in this section we're actually gonna have a separate artifact section and stat section, mostly because it's good to explain both of them separately so you get to understand why we're building Beidou this way. So starting with artifacts, remember when everyone said you were gonna be living in the Emblem of Severed Fate domain forever? Yeah, that's still the case. To preface the artifact section, there are a lot of sets that work. 2-piece Thundering Fury gives 15% electro damage bonus, so it's good for her kit. 2 Gladiator or Shimenawa gives 18% attack, so it's good for her kit. 2 Noblesse Oblige gives 20% elemental burst damage bonus, so it's good for her kit. Any combination of those is solid. Beidou is a classic case of stats over sets where all of her quote-unquote best sets are closely matched. Emblem of Severed Fate is no exception either, but it's a lot more resin efficient to farm than the other listed sets. A ton of characters use 2-piece Shimenawa, and almost every character in the game can use some part of Emblem of Severed Fate effectively. Having 20% energy recharge on the 2-piece followed by a 4-piece that increases burst damage based on ER is insanely good value, especially when Beidou does need a little bit of energy to function well. So of all the sets that I mentioned, Thundering Fury, Shimenawa Gladiator, Noblesse, and Emblem is going to be your most resin efficient one to farm for and put together. Even though your skill damage will be lower with Emblem than other sets, the potential to increase your burst damage coupled with it being very flexible and farmable makes it her best choice. If you're really about min-maxing your Beidou, you can use 4-piece Thunder Soother in an Electrocharge team. You'll see the highest damage dealing for her with Thunder Soother since it gives a 35% damage bonus to enemies with Electro applied, but if you plan on running her outside of an Electrocharge focused team, I definitely don't recommend using it. And also 4-piece sets can be harder to farm. That being said, again, you should focus on stats over sets for Beidou. What I mean by that is if you have insane crit value on 2-piece Thundering Fury, Noblesse, or Gladiators and not on your 4-piece Emblem set, you'll want to take the set with better stats. We're actually going to move on to stats right now just to talk about what exactly you're looking for. So for Beidou's stats, you're basically going to want to build her like you would any damage dealer, but to make the most of her, you're going to want some energy recharge. Now, to be honest, Beidou's energy needs are pretty overblown by the community. She does need ER for sure, and if you build her without ER, you're going to have a rough time always having her burst up. But there are lots of solutions that fix her energy based around team building and artifacts. If you're playing Beidou with a second Electro and activating Electro Resonance, for example, that she'll only really need between 120 and 140 energy recharge. Now, if you do build a solo Beidou, you will need more than that. You're going to need between 160 and 180 energy recharge to be comfy. Just know that these are kind of generalistic calculations on energy recharge and how much you would need to always have your burst up. Your situation could be vastly different from the person next to you, depending on what the Spiral Abyss is like, depending on the content that you're clearing, your team. All of these things will factor into how much energy you need to keep her burst up 100% of the time. So 120 to 140 with double Electro and 160 to 180 with solo Beidou is a good general place to be. So if your Beidou is being run with another Electro character or just a battery character in general, you don't need energy recharge sands at all. You can actually get energy recharge you need on her with just the 2-piece effective Emblem or some energy recharge substats. Even with Emblem in this case, you'll want to build her with an attack percent sands, electro damage goblet, and crit circlet. Usually with crit you want a 1:2 ratio, so that's going to look something like 50 crit rate to 100 crit damage or higher than that if possible, but a 1:2 ratio would be ideal. If you decide to run solo Beidou though, you actually can and should use an energy recharge sands on her. Ideally, if you're running Beidou without an electro battery, you're going to want attack buffers in your team like Bennett, Thrilling Tales, Noblesse, or Tenacity to make up for her lost attack. Remember, for solo Beidou, we're shooting for between 160 and 180 energy recharge, and with an energy recharge sands, you already get 51% of that out of the way, and if you're using Emblem of Severed Fate, you already have 71% of that done. You're still going to want an electro goblet and crit circlet for the most damage though. And I know there's a lot of confusion on whether or not you should use an energy recharge sands since there are energy recharge weapons, so we're going to actually talk about weapons right now. There's a lot of confusion regarding her best weapon and whether or not running weapons with energy recharge on her is good. So I'm going to go over most of the weapons that are useful for her and talk about why each one is good. For the weapon rankings, these will all be at Refinement 1, but just know that with refinements, these can change. And these weapon rankings are based off of both my own gameplay as well as spreadsheets made by known theory crafters. So first, if you look at any weapon ranking for Beidou, it's going to say that Wolf's Gravestone has the highest damage ceiling for her. That's technically true because its passive is really strong and it buffs your whole team when it activates. However, However, the weapon following Wolf's Gravestone is Serpent Spine, and from my experience playing Beidou, I actually think it's a little bit better. For those of you guys who don't know, Serpent Spine is a broken Battle Pass claymore that's considered one of the strongest weapons in the entire game. It's a crit rate claymore, which already makes it extremely valuable, but it gives you damage bonus while the character is on the field. When you take damage, and I mean damage because getting hit with a shield doesn't count, you lose a stack of damage bonus. But the main thing to think about is that the stacks don't go away when you're off the field, and corrosion also does not affect them. On top of that, Beidou's burst snapshots buffs, so even if you lose stacks, you maintain the damage bonus through the duration of her burst. Overall, this weapon is super broken, and with Bennett, it can actually outperform Wolf's Gravestone even at Refinement 1. With more refinements, it just gets more broken. Now, if you have Redhorn Stone Thresher, it can be a really solid option because of its insane crit value, but if you're not using Beidou as an on-field carry, you lose out on a lot of its value, since its passive gives normal and charged attack bonus. Now, if you're looking at Unforged, it ends up being good in teams with shields, but it's still slightly worse than Wolf's Gravestone and Serpent Spine. The newer claymore Akomaru is actually very good with Beidou for burst damage in the right teams. It increases elemental burst damage by a percentage of the max energy your team has in total, and since Beidou has a high cost burst, you're already partway there. Now, there's no general consensus for how much energy you actually need for Akomaru in terms of just making it a very good weapon, but as long as the rest of your team doesn't have a 40 cost burst, you're probably going to be fine for damage. It's still really solid. Another option you have is to run Skyward Pride, which is actually pretty underrated for Beidou. Its passive at Refinement 1 increases all damage by 8% for Beidou, which is great, but you also get energy recharge from its main stat. Now, to be honest, with a second Electro or General battery, Beidou won't need Skyward Pride energy because you can get enough energy recharge with substats, so overall it will lose a lot of value there. But if you're running Beidou without a battery or second Electro, so solo Beidou, Pride actually ends up being really comfortable and contributes to the energy threshold you want to meet. The one thing to note about Pride is that its bonus Vacuum Blade damage won't actually activate off field, so in that way you do miss out on a little bit of its ability. Now, for free-to-play players who were around when the Fish Claymore dropped, this weapon actually ended up being Beidou's best free-to-play non-gacha option since it increases burst damage passively and scales on attack. Also, it's just kind of hilarious to hit enemies with a giant fish, like that's awesome. The Lithic Blade with 3 Liyue party members is really strong for its crit rate passive. Blackcliff ends up being a good stat stick, and if you're completely free to play, Prototype Archaic is a solid craftable weapon. Even if you're a low adventurer's rank, you can get a few claymore crafting materials from quests and sigil shops, so Prototype Archaic should be accessible to everyone. If you have Song of Broken Pines, it can be a good stat stick for Beidou since it's got crazy base attack, but it does lose a ton of value if you play Beidou off field, so I wouldn't recommend it over something like Lithic Blade or Blackcliff unless you're playing Beidou on field. The last weapon I want to talk about is Sacrificial Greatsword, which is where the energy weapons argument comes in. It has a chance to reset your elemental skill cooldown when you hit enemies with your skill, which is actually really great for battery characters. It can be a decent option if you're a really good player and can do 2 perfect counters in a row, but it is a significant damage loss over other weapon options if you don't perfect counter often. The second perfect counter will compensate for some of the loss of stats for her burst, but that's about it. One other note about Sacrificial is that it can also just be fun to play, so even if it gets beaten out by Lithic Blade and sometimes Archaic, it's pretty satisfying to turn Genshin into a combo fighting game. There are tons of other weapons in the game, but Prototype Archaic ends up being better than those options anyways, so in a worst case scenario, you should be going for Prototype Archaic. So now that you know how to build Beidou, we're going to talk about Beidou's teams. This is one of the most important parts about playing Beidou, so I highly suggest you listen to the whole thing. And also just know that all the teams I'm going to suggest today aren't all of the teams that are available for Beidou. I just only have 4 team slots. So anyways, one of Beidou's greatest weaknesses is that she functions best in teams with a second Electro, which can lower your team's damage in comparison to Melt and Vaporize teams. That being said, there are very strong teams that aren't only focused on Vaporize and Melt. Since Beidou's burst can proc once per second, you want to use fast attacking characters to drive her burst to proc as many times as it can. There are lots of characters who can take advantage of Beidou in that way, and tons of characters who are enhanced by Beidou, for example, Child. In this team, you're going to utilize Child's fast attack combo, Riptide, and Electro Charge to keep enemies stunned and chain AOE damage. Fischl will deal Electro damage as well as battery Beidou, and with the Tenacity set, will actually buff the entire team as well. For the 4th slot, you can run Sucrose or Bennett, but I prefer Bennett for heals and the buff he's able to give your whole team. You get 20% attack from Bennett's Noblesse set, and you can snap snapshot the buffs he gives you in his burst, so Beidou's burst will actually do insane damage. You can also replace Bennett with Sarah if your Bennett is occupied, and you'll be able to snapshot all of her buffs except for her C6 crit damage buff with Beidou. This is one of my favorite teams for deleting tons of enemies at once. The one downside of this team is that it's not nearly as strong against bosses, since in general electrocharge reaction damage isn't as strong as Melt and Vaporize. And on top of that, Child is a character that gets a lot of value from Riptide and AOE, hitting lots of trash mobs or just lots of enemies at once, and you don't get to hit a lot of enemies at once in boss battles, so just in general, Child in this electrocharge team with Beidou is not going to do super well against bosses in comparison to some of the other teams. The next team that I want to talk about is a Firecrackers team. Now this team is going to consist of Best Girl Yoimiya as the main driver and on-field damage dealer, with Beidou causing massive electro damage and overload, which will help keep enemies away from Yoimiya and deal AoE damage. You also use Xingqiu on Fischl in this team, with Xingqiu to give you Vaporize and extra damage, and Fischl to deal extra electro damage and help Beidou keep 100% uptime on her burst. Both Beidou and Xingqiu give you a bit of stagger resistance too, which is the main reason for using Xingqiu over Bennett, because even if Bennett gives you higher damage than something like Spiral Abyss, finishing Yoimiya's combo should come first. So basically, it lets Yoimiya finish her combos without a shield. It is worth noting that Bennett also heals though, and technically speaking, if you do want to max Beidou and Yoimiya's damage, you can use Bennett instead of Xingqiu. You could also just run solo Beidou and replace Fischl with Bennett, or you can replace any of them with Yunjin. There's just a lot of flexibility in this team because all of the units can complement each other in some way. But the main reason for Firecrackers being strong is just that Yoimiya attacks very fast, which can drive Beidou damage and reactions, effectively giving Yoimiya AoE. Just be careful with this team in general because Yoimiya is made of paper and she must be protected at all costs. The next team I'm going to be talking to you about is Shock Rocks, like the candy, but it's real rocks and it's not pop, it hurts. This team is for people that ship Ningguang and Beidou, and it actually works super well. Ningguang is already a very strong carry unit, but likewise, Beidou can also be classified as a carry, so the total damage output in this team can be really rock solid. With all of Ningguang's Star Jades having the opportunity to proc Beidou's burst, as well as their C1 AoE, you're going to be getting near maximum procs every use. Fischl is there to battery as usual, but she also gets a lot of bonus damage out of her Ascension passive that deals bonus electro damage when the character on field reacts with electro. So for Ningguang, that would just be creating a lot of electro shield shards. For the fourth slot, you can use Albedo or Zhongli. Either is going to work because you generate enough shield shards so that even if you don't have Zhongli, you're going to have pretty solid coverage. But Zhongli can also be great for his resistance shred too, and his shield is always reliable. Unless you're in corrosion, then you're kind of screwed. The fourth and final team that I want to talk about today is Beidou on field, which is basically for those of you who like Beidou's attack animation, because she kicks a sword. Since Fischl, Bennett, and Xingqiu are such strong units by themselves, you can kind of just steamroll content with all these characters and Beidou as the on-field carry. Now it is worth noting that this team doesn't actually work with C6 Bennett because the pyro application from Beidou normal attacks with C6 Bennett will overload and knock enemies away, so as long as your Bennett isn't C6, all of these units will deal tons of damage and clear most content without too much effort, but at C6 it can get a little annoying. Yeah, basically this entire team is just like hit things with strong supports and Beidou. I just want to point out a couple more notable units that I didn't really include in these teams. So the first one is actually going to be Eula, who's actually pretty okay with Beidou as a rule, but the main reason I didn't feature a team for her and Beidou is because Fischl and Raiden pair better with Eula for battery purposes, since Eula will want to use her burst as often as possible. That being said, they can work together. The other one is Raiden, who tons of people are pretty upset about. If you didn't know, Beidou's burst won't activate when Raiden's burst is active, because Raiden's burst attacks count as elemental burst hits so that they can actually get the damage bonus from Emblem of Severed Fate rather than normal and charged attacks. If you're talking about the most optimal play, it's true that Beidou and Raiden don't work together, but generally speaking, both of these characters are very strong, and even if you can't use them at exactly the same time, you'll basically always have Beidou's burst ready with your main carry and can use Raiden in the downtime. That being said, it is not perfect, but that doesn't mean they're allergic to each other. And a lot of people just tend to overreact to how bad the synergy is. It's not actually as bad as people are making it out to be, it's just not perfect. But that being said, if you're only into optimization, then yeah, it's not going to work for you. You don't want to run Raiden and Beidou together. Now let's move on to Constellations, because I do want to quickly tell you which ones are valuable and why you should be going for Beidou Constellations. So really quickly, I'm going to explain what these do and why they're good. Beidou's Constellations are pretty strong, potentially even some of the strongest ones for a 4-star unit in the game. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So Beidou's Constellation 1 gives Beidou a shield when she activates her elemental burst. The shield isn't actually that strong, but it'll tank a hit or two, and in conjunction with Xingqiu, it can be a very strong utility, especially considering you're going to be re-upping her burst pretty often. Just taking 1 or 2 extra hits from enemies will make it a lot more comfortable to play Beidou in teams where you don't actually have a shielder. Now Beidou's Constellation 2 C2 is incredible. It makes her burst able to jump 2 more times per activation, which increases her damage ceiling by a ton. To be clear, that means 2 times per activation, which is up to once a second. So basically, you're getting the 3 initial damage procs of her electro damage, and then you're getting an extra 2 on top of that, assuming there are enough enemies to proc it. It is ridiculous. Now, Beidou's Constellation 3 is a little less impressive. It just increases her counter by 3, and C4 is kind of a similar deal. It lets Beidou deal bonus electro damage on attacks after taking damage. Now, for some reason, it says normal attacks only, but it actually applies to charged attacks too. I don't know if that's a translation thing or a bug. I don't know. It's not much of a damage increase though, unless you have her as an on-field carry, and even then, it's not a ton of damage. Her Constellation 5 is pretty good though, because it increases her burst level by 3, and her burst does a majority of her kit damage. And Constellation 6 decreases enemy electro resistance by 15% during her burst, which is great for team flexibility since you won't need to use an animo support for the same thing. In general, Beidou's constellations are very good. Like, the value you're getting out of her C6 and her C2 is insanely good value. It's going to add so much damage to your Beidou. Just so you know whether or not you should get them, her best constellation is C2, but C5 and 6 are also very good. If you're at Constellation 1 and you have the opportunity to pick up another Beidou, I would say that's a good pick. Now, I'm making this video before the day has flipped over in the Stardust and Star Glitter shop, but you may be able to pick up a Beidou constellation at the start of February, so that is something else to keep in mind. So now that I've told you how to build and play Beidou, you honestly, you should be a Beidou expert by now, hopefully. Hopefully you've learned something. Beidou's an incredible unit that's often not used or considered a meta pick just because of her battery needs and her being an electro unit. But in normal Genshin Impact player fashion, her needs are blown way out of proportion a lot of the time. Especially with access to the resin efficient emblem set as well as new units coming soon, Beidou might see a lot more play. The major change will likely happen when Abyss turns into less bosses and more trash mobs, but we'll have to see. In general though, I have to reiterate, she is such a strong unit. She gets so much value with her elemental burst, and if you're building teams with Child or Yoimiya, she can be an excellent complement to those, and so many more characters on the roster and in the future. If you're looking for an electro carry, she's your pirate. With all that being said, you guys, thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed, it would mean the world to me if you would subscribe down below and leave a like on the video if it helped you out. Let me know in the comments who you're actually using with Beidou, because I love seeing all the creative teams you guys come up with. And one last plug, I do go live on Twitch a couple days a week at twitch.tv/Braxophone. If you want to come check it out, we do some live Genshin stuff, but we're also doing a little bit of variety with Legends Arceus right now. So anyways, you guys, thanks again for watching. I'll catch you next time.